You start.
Good afternoon. Today we're going to talk about the criteria that we used that was essential for selecting and buying a piece of land. We had to research this quite carefully because we've got very specific needs, which are not normal for people who are building a day-to-day house. Garisha?
Well,
Let's just list out the criteria we had when looking to buy land.
price.
These are the criteria that we looked at for every piece of land that we looked at. Go on, Garisha.
Well, it was kind of organic the way it developed, because you start off with the obvious ones like price and location, and even
Size.
and also the parameters for that. You start off with something which is unrealistic and optimistic, and then that varies.
Like any house purchase or any purchase, price was an obvious bracket.
Then
But that was organic.
I'm going to keep this running, right? And then location. So preferably something within about an hour and a half driving time, because there'll be many weekends where we drive up on a Saturday, come back home, do the same on Sunday, and once we have things going, we might just stay up there over the weekend and camp out.
Or potentially even commute from that area.
Yeah. Then if you want land which is nice, beautiful, wooded, fairly isolated, and more importantly, a place which has less restrictions simply because it's not heavily residential, you then hit upon the fact that you are not going to be connected to the grid. And we partially also wanted to be off grid. Now, I don't know whether it will be fully possible to do it, but the land we look at ended up not having water or sewer connections, which means we have to get a well dug, we have to put a septic system in, and we also have to arrange for a power connection. We are looking into getting solar and potentially being off grid. We can talk about the solar aspect, the capacity, batteries, and all that later.
And there's going to be another video that gets done about septic systems alone.
In
that's
detail.
Quite a complex subject.
Yeah. So fundamentally, let's start off with whether there is water available. Unfortunately, you can never be 100% sure unless you actually drill it. It's part science, part art, and part black magic, honestly.
Well, let's think about some of the practical parts of the land that we're looking for. Something we obviously needed, ideally, there to be a reasonable flat section of land that we could build on. We looked for forest cover, just to provide some privacy and protection, and for aesthetics, we like the idea of being within trees. We're hoping to get a river, with something with a nice natural
Not a river, just a stream.
A flow of water.
Yeah. You've jumped across. I was talking about the well. So there should be potential for being able to get water.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, sorry. Yeah.
Then it should be perkable, which I'll talk about later. If you cannot perk, you cannot put a septic system in, you cannot build. Effectively, it means it's a non-buildable lot. You should have power lines fairly close by, because guess what? The cost to connect to the grid is extremely high, and every county has different rules about whether you can be off grid or not. They might allow you to have solar, but doesn't mean they'll allow you to be completely off grid. And those the cost to connect to the existing power lines can be atrociously high. So another factor which determines if a lot is buildable is the zone in which it falls on. So there is, again, the codes and the meanings associated with the codes are different for every county, but roughly there are things like residential zones where you can definitely build, and even residential has subsections which is related to density of building. Then there is agricultural zone where all you can do is only agricultural buildings, and you have to be very careful about how agricultural buildings are defined. So you might not be able to put a primary residence even if what you're doing there is farming. Then there are RDT zones, which is rural density transfer zones, where a certain density is allowed. So only one house is allowed per 25 acres. And an owner might parcel off and sell just 2 or 5, a part of that 25 acres, and say it is in the RDT zone with potential for development. But unless you're sure that the original 25 acre doesn't have a house, tough luck, you might not be able to build a house if they already have used up that rule for building a house. And you'll be surprised that most listings do not provide that information. We also realize that most people who sell land are rich or fairly big landowners who don't necessarily bother to mark off the boundaries of the land or provide all the information online in the MLS listing. So you have to dig out all that information. And I'll talk about that again in another video about how to pull out county records and things like that. So what's the other criteria for us?
Other criteria about it, and it's more aesthetic, I suppose, as we look at the land, we want privacy, but we also want to be not so remote that it becomes unsafe. So it's the idea of having neighbours, but not ones that are so close that they're in your backyard. It's fair to say it.
Yeah. Then we wanted enough forest cover. We wanted trees, but we wanted flat land now. Or if flat land was not available, how much is it going to cost to clear it? How much is it going to cost to get an access to it? And also, can we get access to it? Is it connected to a public road? And then there are rules. You have to get permits to get connectivity. And even if you're willing to not have fancy access, sometimes there are rules where they tell you on the plat of the land as to if the county expects you to maintain a certain level of access in order to fulfill things like access for fire engines and emergency services.
And sometimes in the more rural areas, your piece of land could be only accessible through a shared road, and there are always issues with shared roads about who's responsible for repairs, for winter clearing, blah blah blah. Potentially it can be a point of contention. So it was always something again that we looked at to see if that was going to be a factor or not.
Yeah, and shared roads could be obvious when you walk in and you will see it shared with a neighbor, in which case the rules are probably already clear, and you just have to read what's called the covenants and the easement access, right of access. You also have to be careful that even if there is a dedicated road or access to your land, if your land is in the way of some other land, it's possible that tomorrow a development which comes behind your land or in front of your land would then contend with your land for access. So the access to your land might end up being through another land, or access to a third land might come through your land. So you have to be careful that your land is not falling on the way or in between other pieces of land. Then Verizon access. Cellular.
Yeah, so we do plan that we would be able to work and communicate when we're on the land. So assuming that there's no cable connection, then we really need good cellular connectivity. We both work on one network, so we always tried to make sure that there was strong cellular signal on the land, so we knew that we could at least connect, make calls, that kind of thing. It just makes things a lot easier and a lot safer as well.
So we used to walk around the land and web browse, call each other. You might be, if you're watching this video, you might be one of my friends who received a call from me telling, I'm testing out the connection on this land if I'm all alone. Um, what's next? You also check, you can look at county records to see what future development is coming in that area. So, you put all this effort into getting this nice, quiet place, and the next lot might be given to developers for putting a residential, multi-story development, or there could be a factory coming up. So things like that are provided in long-range county plans, which you can access online.
A big aspect as well, though, that was a thing we considered was the facing of the land. So that was, did it get natural sunlight through most of the day, so you could start to get a picture in your head if you put a building down or planted some food or whatever, that it was going to be in sunlight. So that'd be like a south facing,
Yeah.
on a south facing slope, this kind of stuff. That was quite important. The other thing as well, kind of related to that, is if you get a very heavily forested plot here, again, it depends how the land is zoned, and then you can sometimes only clear up to 1 acre of trees. So if you're heavily forested and you've got to knock some down, depending on the size, you probably won't be able to cut it all down, but you can clear out 1 acre. And there's always a bit of ambiguity about how they know you've done, who comes to check, but basically that's the rule, that you can't take out more than 1 acre.
We are actually trying to avoid taking down trees. In fact, the land we have got, we'll end up not cutting down any tree to the extent we'll be trying to get into a forest conservation program, but we'll talk about
Just
that.
raising the point.
Yeah, but we have to be aware that you want to document things, that you are not taking trees down.
And the other thing is as well, if you're depending what you want to do, if you're just building a house or if you're wanting to do more than that, what are you allowed to do? So in the county, Frederick County, if you've got more than 3 acres of land, you're legally allowed to farm on it.
You're legally allowed to have, you can farm on anything. You're legally allowed to have animals about 3 acres.
Okay.
Even if it is zoned residential. If it's zoned agricultural, of course, there is no issue. But even if it is zoned residential,
Like this one, like ours is.
yeah, otherwise we wouldn't be able to put a house on it.
And that's it.
And coming back to the south and east facing sun, typically you will be putting windows and trying to on the south or east face of the house. And if you want to look into more details for that, it's called passive solar design. Again, a lot of our videos talk about things in the high level. There is a lot of discussion and work which goes on further beyond this, but we are hoping our videos will teach you the process on how to plan and how to think and go about it. Just to go into each one of these topics we talk about, there are plenty of resources, but this kind of gives you what I call like a system level view, and you know how to think about it. So it's called passive solar design, and you can look into that.
And there are other things that are less important as well, which are, and weren't really a go, no go, or even really thought about, but something you could be thinking about is what the soil types and things are like on the land. You can obviously, whatever's there, you can augment. If you're in a completely rocky property, you can still grow stuff but you've got to think about the cost of doing that. So it's not just that, yes, you can do it, you can bring in tons and tons of soil and clear rocks, it's the cost and the time to do that. As soon as you need a machine coming on the ground to clear off rocks and stones and stuff, that's time, it's money, and same if you're putting soil down. So if you're buying it hoping to plant stuff quickly, you need to know that you'd want to maybe either test the soil or at least check, that you've got some kind of growing area.
Yeah, and we were lucky. I wouldn't say lucky, like I said, we put in a lot of effort. We didn't go and look at this land at night just because of the way where it was located, but we would recommend going and looking at the land at night. And myself especially, I cared about security, and I would always stand on any piece of land and think, how am I going to feel if I have to walk into an empty house at night, late at night, say after a business trip, an emergency errand at 11 or 12 at night when there is snow and it's dark and it's cold. And unless you're comfortable doing that, you shouldn't,
Or at least
really
look
go
how you
ahead.
can make it more comfortable. But
Exactly.
another thing we looked for on land from a safety perspective was to see if there were. We did see a couple where you would get beer bottles and cans and stuff, and old cars where they've been dumped, and it's obviously where people had been hanging out, drinking or partying or whatever at night, and it's always become a bit of a local hub for that. And if that's there, it's not necessarily a no go, but it raises a red flag. That this isn't either indicative of the area or how it's being used or what people think about it, that it's a dumping ground or it's a place to, quiet enough that no one's going to disturb them if they're out there partying. So you don't want necessarily to be in the middle of you have to be responsible for clearing all that off.
And I think the last point is every time we would see a new piece of land and we had visited it a couple of times and we'd be driving back home and always turn around to Alan and say, forget the price, forget how far the drive is from the house. How do you feel? What's your gut feeling about the land? Are you going to be happy about it? And like so many other, big money purchases, that is particularly important. Otherwise, if you go into something this huge half-heartedly, or you have doubts, nagging doubts for which you can't give a logical explanation, it is still not good. So we would always thrash that out for different lands and say, okay, these are the last 3 lands we looked at, on a scale of 10 to 1, where does this feel on comfort level, on your gut feeling, outside of logic, budget, location. And I think that's one of the big factors which helped us say, yes, we are going for the piece of land. I mean, making the final decision and saying, yes, we're going to sign on the dotted line. That feeling of comfort should be there. And you, depending on your personal situation, you also want to see what is your escape from this, in the sense, if things don't work out, is this land in a place where you can sell, where you can walk out, and at what point are you willing to walk out? How far into the development are you willing to go? For example, if we put our vegetable garden, get a well dug, get a septic in, we can walk away from it and probably recoup the cost, because the vegetable garden can be destroyed by future
people don't see it and think, oh, I'm not touching that piece of land, it's got a vegetable garden.
Yeah.
But there's a point of where you're making improvements, and then there's a point where you're turning it into a building site that will turn people off. So it's just knowing, and you've got to keep it very realistic and not get too emotionally attached to a piece of land that you think, you have to keep ploughing on with it. Even there could be criteria you need to think about that, or at what point it's hurting your lifestyle or your life or whatever, and you think it's time to pack this in.
Yeah, and just like when you buy a house, unless it's in writing, it is not true. So if there is any fact about the land, which is, especially we found this for land, where they'll say, the wording can be vague. It can say lots of potential, or you could build a big house, but check. They're not obligated
like,
to anything.
Great building plot. And so it would be, but if you don't get permission to build, then no, it's not a great building plot.
Yeah, and the permission to build is can be confirmed only when you talk to the county and look at records. And like I said, that's a different video altogether. So hopefully that covers most of what we looked at.
Yeah, that's good.